What's up guys, welcome back to Doki Doki Drawing. We've got an advice video for you today, and thanks to Aura Blood, aka Manga Striker, who has submitted some art for us to have a look at. Hinoe, our professional Japanese animator, is going to be looking at this picture. Of the 4 images that were submitted, we're looking at the one of the centaur. So we asked Hinoe his initial thoughts on this artist's drawing. And he said if you're going to draw a horse-style character, it does help to look at a real horse while drawing. Since he draws a lot of dogs and cats and horses for work, he felt he couldn't really accept this as a horse body. So he got started doing his redraw of this character. I suppose the character's name is Kayo. And as always, Hinoe started by using a circle shape to decide the size and position of the pelvis. But I asked Hinoe, in a drawing like this, is it kind of like you have to draw 2 pelvises? Well, Hinoe says a centaur is like a human body which has been placed in a horse, but the horse part of the body takes priority. Now, I don't actually know if that's the question I was trying to ask him at the time. I think what I really meant was that because you've got the front legs and the back legs, and you kind of draw 2 separate circles to decide the position of the legs. I kind of thought it was a bit like drawing 2 humans in front of each other, but with like a stomach in between. Anyway, I think that part kind of got lost in translation. Now, looking at the original art, I was personally mostly concerned about the fact that the human body doesn't seem to be looking the same direction as the horse body. Hinoe says you only really need to match the lower torso of the human part to the horse part of the body, since the upper torso of the human body can move more flexibly. We then moved on to talking about the weapons that the character is holding, and I was wondering if there's some kind of advantage to fighting with an axe in a war situation compared to maybe something like a sword. Hinoe points out that you can smash right through a shield if you've got an axe. And back when weapons like those were being used, things like the Morning Star were quite popular. A Morning Star being the weapon with an iron ball attached to the end of it. Hinoe says that weapon was incredibly powerful. I then asked Hinoe if axes can be thrown as a weapon, to which his response is, maybe if it were a hatchet you could throw it because they're not so big. Now recently I've seen on Twitter there was a place apparently in Japan where you can throw axes as kind of an experience. Hinoe says he's heard of a shuriken dojo but not an axe throwing dojo, and that since they've decided to let tourists into Japan now, that sort of thing may well get quite popular. But rather than an axe or a shuriken throwing studio, I asked Hinoe if maybe something like an anime studio where you could go in and actually experience being an animator would be popular. Hinoe says, if you'd really like the experience, I'll make you work. I asked him, does it pay well? And he says, the hourly rate is low. But I told Hinoe, I really think that if there were such an experience, that people would try it. But Hinoe kind of disagreed. He said he thinks that people would most likely want to run away after an experience like that, which personally I think would be a learning experience in itself. But Hinoe reiterated, anime is something you watch, not something you do. We then started looking at the way that the axes were being held in the original illustration. Personally, I was concerned about whether the character would actually be able to hold such a heavy weapon in that angle with only, that kind of grip. But when Hinoe looked at the drawing, the first thing he thought was, don't run away from drawing hands. And it's quite a good observation. In this drawing, both hands are perfectly hidden behind different parts of the body. But with regards to my question about whether an axe could actually be held the way that this character is holding their axes, Hinoe says an axe like this is just too imbalanced anyway. He said it looks like the Getter Tomahawk from an anime called Getter Robo. So I pointed out, well, if it was a robot anime, maybe the robot just has really strong wrist parts. To which Hinoe rightly replied, well, this is a fantasy character, so maybe it's super strong too. Now, at some points, Hinoe was actually using a ruler to draw straight lines, especially the parts on the weapons. So personally, I pointed out it's important to use a ruler when you're drawing straight lines. But a really cool tip that Hinoe pointed out is that if you use the ruler just to draw out a guideline, and then you draw the actual line freehand, it gives you a really nice textured effect. If you are interested in seeing more about how to use a ruler to do things like drawing curved lines, we have a separate video where Hinoe points out how to do just that. Be sure to check the links in the description. Hinoe says he really can't get used to digital drawing, so he still uses a physical ruler and just places it on the screen when he wants to draw straight lines. Apparently this is because opening the ruler tool every time is too bothersome. Now personally, I remember there was one feature on iPad when you opened up the Notes app. You could rest 2 fingers on the screen and temporarily a ruler would appear in that position, and then when you lifted your hand off the screen, the ruler would disappear. But I think in later versions of iOS, they just got rid of it. But I agree with Hinoe, using the ruler tool in things like Clip Studio Paint, it's still not natural enough that you would want to use it all the time. So I generally just kind of fluff straight lines because I just can't be bothered to open up the ruler tool. And Hinoe says, well, remember, the people who make this software, they don't actually draw stuff themselves. So as you can see, Hinoe's actually changed the style of axe that the character is holding. It's not got two blades on either side. It's just got one blade per axe. And Hinoe said he's not sure quite how to explain it, but there are different kinds of axes, some for cutting down trees, but then other ones which are actual battle axes for fighting with. One area I was particularly interested to ask Hinoe about is the part where the human body part actually makes contact with the horse part of the body. And if you look closely, you can see in Hinoe's drawing, he's actually kept the hip bone visible on the human part. Now in the original illustration, it's not quite as clear whether that's a hip bone there or if that's just where the muscles of the abs are coming out. Anyway, I said to Hinoe, in the original, the hip bone's not visible because the body is buried in the horse part of the body. And the word for something being buried in Japanese is umaru. And Hinoe goes, oh, was that a pun? Followed by umai, which is also a pun. Umai meaning that's a good one, and uma, which means horse. As you can see here, Hinoe has lifted up one of the horse's legs, and this is different to the pose of the original, which I think really suits this image because it makes the whole character look a bit stronger and more triumphant. We talked briefly about drawing a horse's hoof. Now, if you're interested to see more on that, we have a separate video on horse animation where Hinoe talked about like the backside of a hoof. And I want to point out that you can check out that video as well. But Hinoe said, you're unlikely to have any occasion to draw a horse. To which I replied, actually, animal characters are recently very popular on the internet. And Hinoe says horses are quite common in anime too, but recently they're all done in 3D and the legs particularly aren't modeled very well. Now looking at the head of the character, Hinoe did point out that the original actually had cat-style ears. So in Hinoe's redraw, he's given them more horse-like ears, and you can see they're kind of facing forward more. But something that is good in the original is it looks like the original artist has covered up the human ear portion so it doesn't look like the character has 4 ears. At which point we had a slightly lengthy discussion about the characters in RWBY, because I believe that Blake in the anime series RWBY, I think she might actually have 4 ears because she's got 2 ears on the top of her head which are covered up because she doesn't want people to see them. But even though they're covered up, she still has human ears. So if you know the truth behind Blake's ears in RWBY, be sure to let us know in the comments because I'm actually kind of curious about what's canon. Hinoe says horse ears actually move quite a lot. They don't really move their heads and tilt their heads so much. They can pivot their ears. And one more thing he mentioned is don't approach a horse while their ears are down. Apparently that's kind of dangerous. We then had a lengthy discussion about whether ponies are horses, and apparently from the horse back to the end of their leg, if it's within 140 centimeters, then it's technically known as a pony. But apparently the horses in Japan, originally they were all small horses and they weren't like the big horses that you see in the movies now. So naturally I wanted to know more about what samurai used to ride on. And Hinoe says, don't be fooled by the period dramas on TV, because actually samurai would have been riding around on the smaller horses that were originally already in Japan. Hinoe says that big horses did eventually come to Japan, but actually they're not very good on steep inclines and hills. So apparently these smaller Japanese horses that were originally in Japan were actually better for that kind of terrain. And something also interesting about Japanese horses that he mentioned is that apparently they have much harder hooves, which means one, they don't need horseshoes, but they can slip. So according to Hinoe, apparently these horses were actually knitted like soft shoes to prevent them from slipping, which I'm definitely going to look up sometime because I love the idea of horses wearing little shoes. I asked Hinoe about the position of the eye level in this drawing, and he says he's given it a kind of 2-point perspective, so you can see things are shrinking as they move to the sides of the paper, but at the top and the bottom central portion of the paper, things are at their biggest and closest. And it looks like he's drawn the eye level roughly around waist level. Slightly unusual for Hinoe, he actually brought up a video game. He said, oh, by the way, Uma Musume seems to be a popular game right now. But if they're going to be making Uma Musume, as in horse girl characters, they need to be making the bodies of the characters more like the legs that he's drawing here, like a real horse. And I told him, yeah, but they can still run pretty fast, even though they've only got human legs in the game. And of course, he had to point out they're leaning forward in their animations in that game, but actually Olympic runners, when they're going really fast, they're basically straight up. At which point he added, anime is lying to you. Well, that about wraps it up for this advice video with Hinoe. I think it's a really impressive drawing. I think the original was plenty impressive enough, but Hinoe's redraw is really interesting and provides lots of insight into ways that you might want to try making your character a little bit more realistic, or give it a little bit more of a base on real horse shapes and proportions, a sprinkling of knowledge here and there about the hardness or the shape of a horse hoof and how that might affect the way that you're going to draw that shape. Just having a stronger pose definitely gives the character more of a warrior kind of feel. Adding an S-shaped bend to the tail definitely gives the illustration a bit more energy overall. And after the whole illustration was finished, I added a few more points. It's okay to allow the horse's belly to have some roundness and volume to it. Apparently that's mostly stomach, so unlike a human, it's not so necessary to curve it inwards to give it a waist. And when I asked him about making sure to draw the muscles flexing in the right places so it looks like the character is holding heavy objects, he said, yeah, it's important when you're drawing realistic muscles to know what's expanding and what's contracting. But for now, if you're going to make the character strong, just remember to give some nice curves to the areas where the muscles are. Bulge them out, make them round and strong looking. So hopefully you found some useful advice in this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to click the like button. Let us know in the comments other things that you'd like Hinoe to draw in the future. And also let us know if you enjoy this format of video. Normally we have the original Japanese dialogue, but we do realize it's difficult to read a video and watch a video at the same time. So if you do enjoy videos like this, we might do more of these with English voiceovers instead. And that's pretty much it for this video. Make sure you've subscribed, click the notification bell, and we'll see you next time.